Last Tuesday, you guys voted on an alternate map of Africa. If you haven't watched that video yet, click off now and watch it first for context. Final chance to click off? Alright, this is the monstrosity that you guys came up with. Some key aspects of the map: Britain got immensely screwed over, only gaining the Suez and Lagos, which is absolutely embarrassing for the imperial giant. France then has still secured an impressive empire on the map, but don't be fooled. Most of their empire consists of empty desert. Their Central African holdings have no real way to be reached that don't go through desert or hostile powers, but most importantly, they had to give up on Algeria, by far their most important African territory, which wasn't just ruled as a colony like the rest, but straight up a part of France itself. All in all, France too was heavily humiliated. Ethiopia is a major victor, not just securing their independence, but the entirety of the Horn, while the Ottoman restoration in Egypt, as we'll soon see, may not be as positive as you think. Italian control over Tunis is also more impactful than you might think, as they can now wall off ships from either side of the Mediterranean. Spain controls an empire so large, many questions are raised about their ability to even keep it under control. But perhaps the most evil decision of this alternate partition of Africa was the power that you gave to the Boers. The Boers were notorious for their pro-slavery, anti-African views, and they are now in control over the entire south of the continent. Finally, the Germans stand at the heart of Africa, controlling the Congo and proudly building the only east-to-west railway on the continent, generally being pretty content about their slice of the spoils. But with two angry imperial powers, a couple of weak and potentially unstable nations, and a Germany which, despite their success, is still keen on further expansion, there is only one future for this world. The only question is, how do we get there? But first, we need to address an elephant in the room. Many of these states don't actually have the power to enforce these borders, and France and Britain would never just step away from Algeria or South Africa. Please, just ignore all of that. For whatever reason, these borders have become reality around 1884. But just because they are the reality doesn't mean that they have to be accepted or respected. In Britain, pro-colonial sentiment grows even louder, while anger towards the Germans fester. How in the bloody hell could those crowds have secured a bigger colonial empire than us? In terms of European politics, the British would end their isolation faster, growing increasingly close to France. For now though, the British are focused on a singular objective: Egypt. Does this mean that the Brits go to war against the Turks, defeating the struggling empire and expanding their control of the region? Not necessarily. What this does mean is that the British attempt to turn the Ottomans into an indirect puppet. To the outside world, the British doubled down hard on keeping the Ottomans intact, as any Ottoman instability could result in unrest in Egypt, which is simply unacceptable. But towards the Ottomans themselves, the message is also clear. Britain uses their economic and naval assets to force the Sultan to align with them, with a constant reminder: we could conquer Egypt in the blink of an eye, and good luck with facing the Russians by yourself. So, for now, peace and the borders you established remain. But not for long, as there is a reason that Spain got so few colonies in our timeline. They simply have no hope at actually holding them. Their economy was terrible, their political situation was chaotic at best, and they already had disloyal colonies in Cuba and the Philippines, which the US had an eye on. So, at the first sign of Spanish weakness, the French would move against the Spanish, completely embarrassing them while sponsoring a Moroccan uprising, promising them autonomy under the French. Obviously, the other great powers would also get involved, causing a diplomatic crisis. But I very much doubt that Germany would want to start a war over a collapsing Spanish empire. This crisis would be resolved diplomatically. France crushes Spanish West Africa with an autonomous Moroccan protectorate. In exchange, the Germans are the ones that seize the Spanish Guinean coast while also gaining colonial territories from the French. Now, only Britain demands concessions. It is very likely that the British have purchased the Danish colony at some point, since the territory just cost the Danes a lot to maintain, while they gain very little from it. From this small outpost, the British would get great power approval to overthrow the Sokoto Caliphate anyways, finally giving the Brits a colony that they can feel happy about, and solving the Spanish crisis in a way that leaves everyone happy. But between the great powers, there is now little room for negotiation, and as the decades go on, increasingly clear battle lines are being drawn. In the west are the French and the British allying up, who are favored by Italy, the Ottomans, albeit forcefully, and Russia, although far less enthusiastically than in our timeline. On the other side is Germany, which is supported by pretty much just Austria-Hungary. On the African continent though, the Germans are now far more powerful, especially if we assume that the Ottomans remain neutral, as only a couple of elite divisions would be enough to hold the Nigerian-Cameroon border. At the same time, control over the Congo would absolutely be an economic bonus for the Germans. In terms of Austria-Hungary, let's zoom in a bit on Madagascar, because these dots indicate land set aside for Jewish settlers to found their own state in. But let's be honest, most Jews will prefer to move to America rather than settle in the Madagascar highlands. Despite the Madagascar plan being a nice gesture from the European powers, it would absolutely fail in practice, and New Israel in Madagascar remains nothing more than an interesting historical tidbit. But back to Europe. In our own timeline, the Balkan went through a radical restructuring, only 2 years before the actual outbreak of the war, as the quadruple threat of the Balkan League would declare war on the Ottomans, swiftly overrunning the Turkish positions and expelling them from the Balkan. All of this only happened because the Italians went to war with the Turks first, showing the Turkish weakness. But with Libya already in Italian hands and British oversight over the Turks, this Italian war wouldn't happen. So, the Balkan War wouldn't happen. Meaning, whenever a world war does break out, the Balkan theater looks completely different, with the Ottoman Empire leaning towards the Entente. This could mean two things. First, the Balkan nations lean towards the Central Powers, which would make Russia's position in the Entente really awkward, especially because Russia's main goal in World War I was capturing Constantinople and strengthening their pan-Slavic brethren against the Turks and the Austrians. So, alternatively, I will explore a version of World War I that I have never seen anyone do before. To prevent the Balkan nations from siding with the Germans, and for the Russians to have a shot at claiming Constantinople, Russia forms a third alliance, sympathetic but not fully allied with the Entente. So, we will assume something causes a war between Britain and France on one side and Germany and Austria on the other side, yet, for now, Russia just observes. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with the 2 videos I release every single week, consider doing so. Thank you. The Germans immediately crossed the Belgian border, barreling down the French lines. With a weaker Belgium and no immediate Russian involvement, the Germans managed to even capture Paris, almost breaking the French. But the French realized that surrendering now would mean German hegemony in Europe. This is their only chance. They need to hold on. As British forces arrive in France, the Germans are forced to retreat slightly to more defendable lands and consolidate their lines. Having a hostile city of 1.8 million people on the front lines is probably not ideal. So, Paris falls back into French control. Either way, a devastating blow to French morale and power. To further complicate matters, the colonial war initially favors the Germans as well, who hold the narrow Cameroon-Nigeria border. The Entente do still have naval supremacy though, and so they hold the long-term advantage. All of this means that Portugal suddenly becomes an important player, as their entrance in the war would surely cause the German colonial empire to collapse. But we're not there yet. As in Europe, we have to contend with an even greater crisis. Russia and their allies start a parallel war with the Ottomans, after ignoring French calls to join the war. After all, if Russia doesn't strike the Ottomans now, and the Entente win the war, Britain will never allow them to. So, Russian and Balkan forces barrel down the Ottomans in astonishing speed. And the Russian gamble pays off, as Britain just doesn't have the resources available to defend the Turks, as doing so would indirectly add Russia to the Central Powers. Instead, British forces reinforce their position in the Suez, Cyprus and Arabia, and without warning, launch their own invasion of the Ottoman Empire, occupying Iraq and marching down the Nile. In the face of British and Russian invasions, and no allies coming in to save them, the Ottoman Empire simply accepts their fate. Russia directs the partition of the Balkan portion of the empire, seizing Constantinople and forts around the Bosphorus, finally achieving their Mediterranean access. The rest of the Balkan gets carved up between Bulgaria, Serbia and Greece. The Russians also seize massive territories in the east. The rest of the Ottoman Empire practically becomes a British puppet, while Egypt itself would be directly annexed by the British. But back to the main war. The Germans, for now, have the upper hand, making minor offensives, but failing to seriously break through. And time is ticking. The British not only have naval supremacy, but perhaps more importantly, Germany is hopelessly alone. No European state is even considering joining them. In fact, most are considering joining the Entente. Especially the risk of a late Russian entry has the Central Powers terrified. By now, the Russians no longer have a reason to fight the Entente, but especially the concept of carving up the Austrian Empire is interesting to them. Perhaps in exchange for Entente recognition of the new Balkan borders, the Russians could be persuaded. But the actual first domino that falls comes from Italian entry into the war. This finally wakes the Austrians up, who have left most of the fighting to the Germans up to this point. On the African front too, the Portuguese decide that the time has come for intervention, lauding in the beginning of the end for the Central Powers in Africa. But obviously, the biggest blow comes when the Russian giants enters the war in the east, getting the Balkan powers involved as well. This would spell the end for the Central Powers' chances to win the war. But there is yet hope for the Kaiser. The Russians, under Nicholas II, don't have many demands of the Germans, and begin to push for a negotiated end to the conflict. With no realistic hope at victory, the Germans, reluctantly, grab this lifeline, hoping to negotiate from this slight position of power. The peace conference would still be devastating for the Central Powers though. Russia would be the reasonable one amongst the Entente, minimizing the German losses in Europe to a bit of land in Poland and Alsace and Saarland in the west. Austria-Hungary is less lucky. The Russians themselves seize Galicia, while they also have to give up Romanian majority territories in Transylvania and Slav majority areas to Serbia, with the exception of the territories promised to Italy, as Italy too flexes their muscle after the war. But the remainder gets to live on as an Austro-Hungarian empire, at least for now. This European peace is significantly less harsh on the Germans and Austro-Hungarians. But the colonial peace deal isn't. British participation against Germany was pretty much fully focused on gaining a respectable colonial empire after the war. East Africa is seized by Britain, and importantly, Congo, the heart of Africa, is too. The Portuguese would see a minor expansion of their empire, while France seizes Madagascar and gains most of the remaining Central African territories. Italy, as a token thank you, gets Namibia. With this, Africa has ended up even more centralized in the hands of a select few colonial empires. But the situation we leave Europe in, for now, is even more drastic. The fate of Germany is unclear. While the Kaiser was humiliated, he wasn't driven out by a revolution or a collapsing frontline. It was a negotiated peace. Germany could stay on as a Kaiserreich, perhaps, if criticism on Wilhelm II is too great, with Wilhelm III taking charge instead. But whatever the internal situation of Germany is, they remain on as a, albeit humbled, great power in Europe. Austria-Hungary would come under the rulership of Kaiser Karl, who was a peace and reform-minded man. Perhaps, in an ironic twist of fate, for the continuation of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the lost territory is a blessing, not a curse. Most of the lost territory was amongst the poorest in the empire, and now there are far fewer aggressive neighbors willing to take their land, and far fewer nationalities demanding independence. The dual monarchy would evolve into a triple monarchy, with the Czechs and the Slovaks getting the third crown, and the Austro-Hungarian Czechoslovak Empire being born, though I prefer the name the Triple Monarchy. And that's a situation we leave Europe in for now. But a new conflict looms. The imperial Western democracies grow increasingly opposed to the Russians and their Balkan sphere. Meanwhile, Italy is exploring a new government form under their new dictator, Benito, carving out a third way in Europe. But all eyes remain on the former Central Powers. What role will they play in the upcoming power struggle, and who will come out on top? And that's where I'll end this video, but I'm thinking of making a continuation for this scenario. Let me know in the comments if that is something you would be interested in and what you think may happen next. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment to support the content. Subscribe for 2 more videos every single week. To continue watching, click on one of the 2 videos on screen now. Again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.